Welcome to the Prison Professors Podcast. My co-founders are Sean Hopwood and Justin Paperny. My name is Michael Santos. Members of our team served lengthy terms in prison and we came back successfully. We create podcasts to show how strategies in prison can lead to success. Visit us at prisonprofessors.com to learn more. Welcome to Prison Professors. I am Michael Santos, and we are here with episode 2 with Damon West. If you didn't have an opportunity to listen to episode 1, I encourage you to listen to yesterday's episode because we're listening to an inspiring guy who was a gifted athlete, a college quarterback, an individual who had everything laid out for him to become successful in society. Unfortunately, an addiction to drugs led to the derailing of all of that prospects for success. He was eventually sucked into a world of robberies or burglaries, went to prison with a 65-year prison term. And in this episode, we are going to continue by learning about how Damon was able to use his time in prison to begin preparing for success. Success not only through prison that led him to come home early, but also success throughout the journey so that he could find new meaning and relevance in his life. So Damon, welcome back to the Prison Professors Podcast. And I'd just love it if you could continue telling us about the journey. Once you got sentenced to 65 years, help us understand the mindset of what you intended to do with your life.
Fantastic. So I'm in the courtroom. I've just been sentenced to 65 years. And like I said in the last episode, I hear my mother gasp. That's the first thing I hear. My parents have been there. My family, my brothers, everybody were there for the whole 6 days of the trial. And they heard witness after witness and victim after victim and police officer come up and tell the story about what I'd been up to and what I've been doing and the crimes I've been committing. And so, just like it is, anybody that's been arrested and gone through a setting like that, and the bailiffs are on you in a heartbeat. They're slamming the cuffs on you. They're shoving you out of that courtroom, and they take me. And the last thing I remember saying to my family when I'm leaving that courtroom, head first in handcuffs, is, "I'm sorry, Mom." I try to say it loud enough so she can hear it. And I don't know what I thought that little bit of an "I'm sorry" was going to do, and it doesn't even sound genuine coming from a guy that had just pleaded not guilty to all these crimes and got found guilty and sentenced to 65 years inside of 10 minutes. But that was all I could think to say. And so they shoved me out of the courtroom, and they took me to this little side room that has a bulletproof glass right there. And they have a door on the other side that the bailiffs tell me to wait. And, I remember thinking to myself, Mike, I wish I could talk to my parents, man. I was scared. A lot of thoughts going through my head, kind of in shock. And the door opens on the other side to in and walk my parents. They're giving them a chance to speak to me one last time before I go to prison. And my dad, I remember, was in stunned disbelief. Remember I told you my dad was a sports writer for 50 years. Older guy, doesn't show a lot of emotion. He was just stoic. And my mother, that nurse that's used to traumatic situations, that has kind of taken over handling this stuff for the family, she speaks. And she tells me, she says, "Damon, debts in life demand to be paid." She said, "You just got hit with one hell of a bill from the state of Texas." She said, "But you did the things they said you did in that trial, so you are going to go to prison and you're going to do your time honorably." And she said, "Remember whenever you first got arrested, I told you to get on God's back like in footprints in the sand." She said, "That's what you're going to do." She said, "But check this out. You owe a debt to your father and I." She said, "Your father and I have given you all the love and opportunity and support to be anything you want in life. And more so, you came from a giant melting pot of a city called Port Arthur, Texas." And Mike, a little aside, Port Arthur, Texas is predominantly African-American. When all the white families were moving out of Port Arthur in the 70s and 80s, my parents dug in their heels and stayed because they wanted their kids to go to integrated schools. And often I was one of the only kids, one of the only white kids at summer parties, birthday parties, stuff like that, sporting events, sports teams. My father was the first sports writer in this part of Texas to put a black athlete on the front page of a sports page. That was 1971. And we've got a box of hate mail at home to prove it. But my mom is reminding me of this. She's reminding me of where I came from and the moral compass that my parents gave me. She said, "You owe a debt to your father and I. So here's the debt you're going to pay to us." She said, "You are going to go to prison. You're going to get on God's back." She said, "And you're not going to get in one of these white hate groups while you're in there. You're not going to get in one of these Aryan Brotherhood type gangs because you're scared because you're the minority in there now." She said, you have a better foundation than that. You're a better person than that." She said, "And you will not be getting a bunch of swastikas and lightning bolts tattooed all over you because I've given them you're in county jail for 10 months. I've told them about some of these guys that I've run into in there. She said, you're not going to come out like that. She said, you are going to come out as the man we raised. She said, you come home as the man we raised you to be, or do not come back to us at all. She said, do you understand this debt you're going to pay? And I was like, yeah, Mom, I do. But Mike, I had no clue what I just promised my mother, because I had no clue what I was about to walk into. So get back to my pod. And of course, here comes everybody in county jail that's an expert on prison. I mean, everybody knows every damn thing when you go back into a situation like that. And every guy, I mean, and I think they had a lot of fun with this too, because here I am. I stick out like a sore thumb, man. I'm a middle-class white guy who's never been in trouble. And the general feeling that I got from people is that I represented, I look like the man that is the system, and the system, the man just devoured one of its own by giving me 65 years. And so all these guys are telling me, and I'm asking everybody I can, Mike, at this point, how the hell am I going to survive prison? How am I going to get through this process? Because, I just got a life sentence, and they're telling me, man, you got a life sentence. You're going to the worst part of the prison system, man. And they were explaining to me that the life sentence people come into prison and they have to be on a building for 5 years. They can't come off this building except to go to the chow hall, to go to the law library, or to go to the chapel. Said you just don't get to come off the building, because most escapes happen for people with fresh life sentences. So they said, you are going to go into a pot of hell, man, and you're going to have to fight for your survival every day. Everybody, Mike, black, brown, white, and everything in between was telling me, man, make your life easy. Get into a gang, man. You're 33 years old. You're going to need to get into a gang. But there was this one guy, the guy I talked to you about earlier, named Mr. Jackson. And Mr. Jackson was in his 60s. He had been to prison 4 or 5 times. He was in there in parole violation. And Mr. Jackson pulled me aside. He was always a real positive person, Mike. He pulled me aside. He said, West, I've been watching how you're dealing with all these knuckleheads and these dummies talking about how you got to get into a gang. He said, don't buy into that. He said, you keep that promise you made to your mother and that promise you made to God. And he said, but let me tell you what you have to expect when you go to prison. He said, first thing you need to understand about prison is all about race. He said, race runs the entire institution. He said, it's the most disgusting thing you've ever seen. He said, but that's the way the inmates want it. He said, more importantly, that's the way the administration wants it. They want people divided, but people controlled by their race. He said, so don't get into a wreck over race. And he was explaining in the day room. He said, you'll see a TV in there and you'll see benches in front of it. He said, the first bench is for the blacks, stay off that bench. Second bench is for the Hispanics, stay off their bench. He said, if there's a third bench, that's where the white people sit. Otherwise, you sit on the floor. He said, that's kind of the way it works in prison, especially the part of prison you're going to. He said, and so, this gang thing, he said, just understand that when you get there, all the white gangs are going to take a shot at you first, man. You're going to be their property. You're going to be their claim. He says, you're going to fight the Aryan Brotherhood, the Aryan Circle, the White Knights, the Woods. He's naming all these gangs. My head is spinning. He said, if you survive all that, you do not succumb to their way of life and their ideology of hate. He said, then you'll fight all the black gangs because they'll send them after you. He said, the black gangs will be more than happy to jump on an independent white guy like you because you're out of place. You're not where you're supposed to be. You're supposed to be with the whites. He said, so the Crips, the Bloods, the Gangster Disciples, Mandingo Warriors, you're going to fight all those guys too. He said, sometimes it's going to be more than one on you at a time. He said, but you've got to survive. He said, the thing about prison fighting that you have to understand is that you don't have to win all your fights in prison, but you do have to fight all your fights. And that's really kind of a lesson in life, Mike, because, nobody wins all their fights in life. You're going to lose some battles. Nobody's that damn good to win all their fights. And that's what Mr. Jackson's telling me. He said, no matter what, always fight your fights. Don't ever stay down. And then he gave me an analogy, Mike. He said, West, and Mike, this analogy has been picked up in this new life, and I'll talk about it in the last segment. I get to go all over the country and share my story. And every major college football program in the country will bring me in at some point. Alabama, Clemson, Georgia, Pittsburgh, A&M, Texas, you name it, man. All these schools bring me in because I'm the only college athlete to ever get a life sentence and get out with a chance to tell about it. And so I have a currency with those guys. And I share this analogy. And all these schools have picked up. The University of Georgia has posters in their locker room of the story I'm about to tell you. Mr. Jackson would be blown away how far this analogy has come. So Mr. Jackson says, West, imagine prison as like a pot of boiling water. He said, anything we put in that pot of boiling water is going to forever be changed by the heat and the pressure in there. He said, I want to put 3 things in that pot of boiling water we call prison. He said, first, I want to put a carrot, an egg, and a coffee bean. He said, first things first. He said, if I put a carrot into that pot of boiling water we call prison, he said, Wes, what happens when you boil a carrot? I said, well, Mr. Jackson, it turns soft. He said, that's right. He said, Wes, that carrot went into prison hard, but prison changed that carrot. The atmosphere changed that carrot, turned him soft. He said that carrot went into prison. He got beat. He got robbed. He's got his spirits taken. His hope was gone. And he may have gotten raped and he may have gotten killed. He said, you do not want to be the carrot. He said, all right, let's put an egg in that pot of boiling water we call prison. He said, Wes, what happens when you boil an egg? I said, well, it turns hard, Mr. Jackson. He said, that's right. He said that egg had that hard outer shell, that soft liquid inside, but prison changed that egg too, man. It turned him hard. Now he's hard on the inside as well on the outside. He said he is incapable of giving or receiving love. He has been turned off to love in general. He said that egg has become institutionalized. He said, you know what? He said, if you become that egg, you might as well stay in prison because you're going back on the installment plan the rest of your life. He said, but Wes, if I throw a coffee bean in that pot of boiling water we call prison, he said, what happens when you put a coffee bean in boiling water? And Mike, I didn't know the answer to it. All the formal education in the world that I've had and the experience didn't teach me what happens with a coffee bean when you put it in a pot of boiling water. So I told Mr. Jackson, I don't know. He said, if you put a coffee bean in a pot of boiling water, you got to change the name of the water to coffee. He said the coffee bean, the smallest of these three things, had the power to change the entire atmosphere inside that pot of boiling water. He said, Wes, everybody in life puts out energy, negative or positive. He said, whatever kind of energy you put out, you will get back in return. He said, if you walk around negative all the time with a scowl on your face in that place, he said, you're going to attract the same kind of person. You will get into a lot of wrecks. He said, but Wes, if you walk around positive with a smile on your face, you let these dudes know they're not getting to you no matter what they come at you with, especially on the hard days. He said, you will change that environment from the inside out. He said, the most important thing, the other coffee beans in prison, the other positive people, they will find you because of your positive energy. And that's what he told me. He said, Wes, if you want to find out where a lot of those coffee beans are hanging out in prison, go down to that chapel. He said, you'll find quite a few in there. He said, but you'll find them all over the place. He said, but Wes, you've got to be like that coffee bean. You've got to be like that coffee bean and jump in that pot of boiling water and say, turn this heat up. I got this, man. Change that water into coffee.
That's an awesome story. I now got to thank you and Mr. Jackson for giving us that analogy.
Oh, I mean, what an amazing analogy, Mike. And I sat there and I didn't understand the gravity of it until I got dropped in that pot of boiling water, Mike, because you've been there, man. You know what a pressure cooker that environment is in maximum security prison. But I didn't fully understand the gravity of it. I got a little taste of it in county jail. And I even asked Mr. Jackson, I said, why is county jail so different then? He said, because this isn't anybody's home, Wes. He said, county jail is a temporary stay. He said, all the gangs, the Hispanic gangs, the Tongo Blast, he said, the black gangs, the Crips, the Bloods, the white gangs, the Aryan Brotherhood, the Aryan Circle, he said, these guys are passing through. They don't want to cause too much of a disruption. Some of them may even go home and get a good disposition from a judge or, sign off on something small and go to prison and do a little turnaround. He said, this is nobody's home. He said, but where you're going to, the part of prison you're going to, most people around you are going to die there. He said, that's their home, man. They change when they get in their home. And people get real protective of their homes. So he said, just trust me on this, man. And so, and the last thing he told me before I got on that prison bus, it took about 2 months before that prison bus came to pick me up. And he was telling me, he said, look, man, when you get into that first pod you get into in prison, he said, put your bags down, put your back up against the wall, and wait for it to happen, man. He said, don't try to move around too much. Just wait. It's going to come to you. He's the first guy that comes up to you. He is not coming to do anything but get information from you. He's not going to do you any harm. He said, but the second guy that comes up to you, he said, when he gets within range, put your fist in his mouth, man. He's coming to hurt you. He said, you try to get the jump on as many fights as you can early on. He said, you got to survive that place. But ultimately, the way you're going to survive is you got to be like that coffee bean, man. He said, you cannot sell your soul to that place because it will gobble it up. And I asked him too, Mike, I said, what do you see more of in prison? Coffee beans, carrots, or eggs? He said, eggs by far. He said, the egg is a natural progression of an incarcerated man. He said, you're going to find out you're going to see so many more eggs in there than anything else. It's going to make you sick. And so
remind us again the analogy of the egg. It goes in hard, soft, comes out hard. Tell us again. So
the carrot goes in hard, comes out soft. The egg goes with the soft liquid inside, and it gets hardened by prison, man. The hard-boiled egg gets hardened because of the heat and the pressure of that water. But the coffee bean is the one thing that changes the entire environment. The coffee bean is the smallest of these three things, but it has the power to change the entire atmosphere inside that pot. And I'll get into the next segment. And when I go back into prisons now, I tell those men in white or wherever prison I'm in whatever state that, look, if you become like this coffee bean and you change this atmosphere in here, you'll change the entire atmosphere inside this prison because it'll spread, man. That is infectious, You're either going to infect everyone around you or going to affect everybody around you. And that's just the way life is. You can either infect them or affect them. And
without a doubt. How did you apply that principle of becoming the coffee bean when you did transition into a maximum security prison?
Oh man, so that was a tough part because it happened just like he said, Mike. I mean, the fights, it was brutal. The first couple of weeks, you're fighting all the white gangs, and after that, you're fighting the black gangs. And Mike, it was hard to stay positive in that environment, and I had to remind myself of it. And there were days that I couldn't remain positive, that no matter how hard it is, and anybody listening to this is going to know when they get into the system. I mean, like you said earlier, Mike, you made a great point of these guys chunking around numbers like 20, 25. One day of prison is tough, Each day can be different, and you don't know what you're going to encounter from each man you run into. You don't know what he's going through. You don't know if he just got served divorce papers or what. So each day was tough, especially in those first 6 weeks to 2 months, man. It was so tough, Mike. And I even got to the point where I thought about killing myself because I'm like, man, I don't know if I can do this for a 65-year sentence. And
that's why it's so important to hear stories like you, because you've come back strong with your dignity intact, and people who are spinning out of control need to hear this message. There's an old Chinese proverb that says, if you want to know the road ahead, you've got to ask somebody who's walked back. And that's what we're listening to when we hear Damon West's story. He went into prison with a 65-year prison term, gave us an awesome analogy about the coffee bean and changing the environment around you. And if you're ever feeling down or feeling like you can't do it, just hear the enthusiasm in Damon's voice, and you know that you can do the same. How was it? Again, tell us a little bit about after you were able to overcome those first 6 weeks of challenges, how did you adjust? What did you do with your time while you were in there?
So it's important to note that the only way I got out of that was to think my way through it. I mean, you can't just sit there and fight these fights away. I had to think my way out. So I went out to the basketball court, one of the rec yard, maximum security prison in a life sentence building. And the rec yard is a very segregated place. And I went out there and started playing basketball. I mean, where no white guys are allowed on the basketball court. But I went out there and got to one of the games because I took the basketball when the last shot was over from one of the games. I grabbed the basketball and ran around with it. And finally they let me shoot for teams because that's what they do at the end of each game. They shoot for team captains for the next game. And they told me, man, if you miss that shot, we're going to kill you, man. So, I made my shot, picked my team, went out there to the basketball court for about a week of brutal basketball. But after that week, man, the black guy said, man, you don't have to worry about, the blacks the rest of the time you're in prison. We got your back. You've earned our respect out here. And that was an amazing thing. That was really a transition. So after the fighting was over, Mike, after I got that off my back, because living in that fear, and those guys out there listening to this know that fear, man, that fear of every time those doors roll from your cell for chow, for the day room, for rec, and you hear someone say, West, I want to look at you in the shower, and everybody listening to this knows there's nothing gay about that, man. I want to look at you in the shower means we're going to box, And so that got old. But eventually that was done. It took about 2 months. And so at the end of that, man, I started working on myself, man. I started getting down. And I got into a lot of the chapel programs down there. I got into the chapel programs where there are other positive people, other coffee beans. And I started reading a lot, Mike. I read a book probably every other day while I was in there. And I figured out that I've got to work on myself in 3 areas every single day: spiritually, mentally, and physically, every day. I watched all these guys that would do these push-ups and these pull-ups, and they'd be in the best physical shape. These guys were huge human beings, but they weren't working on themselves spiritually or mentally. They were one-dimensional. And so I started working on myself spiritually, physically, mentally every day. And I figured out, man, you are what you eat, Mike. But that's not just talking about food. That's like, what kind of books do you read? What kind of videos do you watch? What kind of TV do you watch? What do you feed yourself mentally, man? And spiritually, what do you feed yourself? Do you tap into a higher power every day? Do you tap into a higher power every week? And if you don't, you should. You should tap into something out there. Whatever it is you feel is going to help you through that, tap into it. And so I did that. And then I got into recovery when I was in prison. I got into recovery and reading all these books about the history of religions. And there's 5 major religions in the history of the world, man. There's Hinduism, there's Buddhism, there's Judaism, there's Christianity, there's Islam. And at the foundation, at the core of all 5 of these religions, there's 4 spiritual principles that guide all 5 of them. And that is unselfish, honest, pure, and loving. And they're worth repeating, Mike, because they're very important of ideals to live your life by. Unselfish, honest, pure, and loving. And we learn about these in recovery, because if you're not living unselfish, honest, pure, and loving, You're over there on the other side of the spectrum, the other side of the board, where it's selfish, self-seeking, self-want, self-desire, and self-delusion. Like self-delusion is when you believe your own crap, when that little voice in your head tells you how good you are and how much you control in life. And that's a fallacy. It's all fantasy. So I learned about that. But then I learned whenever I got outside of self, Mike.
One second there. I thought you said that there were 5 principles, and I heard unselfish, honest, pure, and loving. Did I miss one?
No, 5 major religions, 4 spiritual principles.
Got it. Okay, continue.
Yeah. Unselfish, honest, pure, and loving. There's 4 spiritual principles, 4 absolutes they call them in recovery. So once I got outside of that, got outside of self and started really working in a program of recovery, and I had my, and I had my faith too, but I know that I'm an addict. And I realized, Mike, that 80% of the people locked up with me have substance abuse issues. Man, I went around polling people, because I had a sociology background. To me, it was like living in a giant petri dish. That's what prison was, a giant lab experiment. So I would go around asking people, Mike, I was sexually molested when I was 9 years old. And I learned through recovery that you try to figure out what the activating event was. And I look back, and that was my activating event, being molested when I was 9. Because by the time I'm 10, I started putting in chemicals like beer and alcohol. And by the time I'm 12, I started smoking pot. And I asked these guys, and so many of the guys I was locked up with had suffered the same thing. They had suffered sexual abuse. They had suffered from being an addict, but not many people were doing anything with it. And so I'm in that program recovery. I'm in a unit with 3,000 people, Mike, and 50 people show up to a recovery meeting every Wednesday morning at the chapel. 50 people out of a potential 2,400, which is 80% of 3,000, that should potentially be there. But 50 people showed up for these recovery meetings. But I knew I was in the right place. And then I learned the secret to life. The secret to life I learned from all these other people that would come into these prisons, these volunteers that would come in with these ministry groups and all these other groups that would come in to help us inmates. The secret to life, Mike, you don't have to go to a seminar or buy a book to figure out the secret to life. The secret to life is one sentence. It's serving others and being humble. And it's a term that goes along with that called servant leadership. And servant leadership is helping other people achieve their goals in life, helping other people raise them up to a different station in life, helping people achieve their goals. And that's the deal, Mike. We've got to help others get to where they want to be in life, for a place that makes them happy. And by helping others, we help ourselves. When I was in prison, I couldn't take any college classes. I had a bachelor's degree already. But I could teach other guys how to read, other guys how to write, do math, get ready for the GED test. I taught guys that were in college classes. I tutored them, I got up every morning, and not every morning, I got up most mornings and taught a class on how to invest in the stock market. Because, a lot of people want to feel like they're still connected to the outside world, and that's a good thing. We talked about this earlier. You said that the mindset for people was to say, well, the outside world out there is gone. No, man, I encouraged them. Watch the news. Watch what that Dow Jones is. I explained to them what the Dow Jones was, the companies that make up the Dow Jones. And I explained to them what the stock ticker was. And these guys got involved. They got interested. And I became like a little professor in the mornings of teaching guys about the stock. We started our own black market stock market with soups and stamps and coffee and all the other things you trade off that commissary, But it was neat. It was something. These guys were enriching themselves. They were growing. But that was what I had to offer. Mike, if I saw trash around that prison when I was walking around, I would stop and pick up the trash. And to the laugh and cackles of so many other inmates, they'd say, man, what are you doing, man? You're a mark. You're a buster. But I told them, I said, this is my home right now, y'all. I've got to make the most of my home. And that was the coffee bean thing. I've got to make my home the best place it can be. And that starts by taking pride in my home. And whenever I was in the rec yard, I would tell guys, hey, man, I'm going to take off. I'm going to the house. And they're like, oh, no, Wes, that's your cell, man. That's not your house. And I'm like, no. You there?
There, we're here. We lost you for a second.
Yeah.
You were talking about saying you're going back to your house, and the other fellow
yeah.
telling you.
Yeah. They're like, no, man, that's not your house. That's your cell. And I was like, no, that's my house. That's where I live for the moment. This is where God has me in life. That's the consequences of my decisions have made G-Pod 45 cell bottom bunk home for Damon West at that point. But, getting the secret to life and then learning about those 4 spiritual principles, that wasn't enough. I still had this fallacy of control. And all addicts know what I'm talking about. We think we're the wizard behind the curtain. We're pulling levers. We're pushing buttons. And we're making things happen. We're manipulating everybody, Mike. And when I say fallacy, I can't stress that word enough, because it is a fallacy. It is a fantasy. And I went to a recovery meeting one day, and the guy that runs the meeting, I don't know if you've ever been in a recovery meeting before, but a lot of recovery meetings start off with a serenity prayer. And he started that meeting off with serenity prayer. And he said, I'm going to diagram this prayer today. And he said, the first part, he said, God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change. And he drew a line from one side of the chalkboard to the other. He said, the things you cannot change are on God's line. He said, but God's line is way bigger than this line on this chalkboard. It goes from one horizon of the earth to the other. He said, and everything on God's line you can't change, so don't touch it. Stay off of God's line. Let God deal with God's things. He said the second part of the prayer, the courage to change the things I can. And he took his fingers about an inch apart and went and erased a little inch out of that line on the chalkboard. He said, if God's line's from horizon to horizon, your line that you work on every day that God gives you is an inch long. He said, and inside that inch, there are 4 things. He said, I will save you the suspense, and I will tell you the 4 things that you control in this life that you get to work on every day. He said, what you think, what you say, what you feel, and most importantly, because everybody's going to see this, what you do. He said, what you think, what you say, what you feel, what you do. Those are the only 4 things you control in this life. So work on those things and quit trying to control what others think, say, feel, and do, because that's outside of your realm of scope. That's not outside of your realm of what you get to work on. He said, because the last line of the prayer was the most important for us addicts, is the wisdom to know the difference between that. He held his hands up real long, like a long line, and that. He put his fingers about an inch apart. And that really made it all come together. It was like the third leg of a stool, you know. And now I understood with these 4 spiritual principles of how I should run my life and how I should run every decision. Is every decision I want to make, is it unselfish, honest, pure, and loving? If it's not, I should avoid those. And I don't do that perfectly. I stumble and fall all the time. And then learning that servant leadership, serving others and being humble is the secret to life, that everything else gets taken care of. And then learning that there's only 4 things I control: what I think, what I say, what I feel, what I do. That really opened the door up for me, Mike. It really made me understand what my role is in this world. And that was a good thing, because it opened me up to being able to work on me and be the best Damon that I can be every single day, and analyze what got me here to this place and what am I going to have to do to not have to come back to this place, you know, because everybody in prison wants out. And one of the things I did when I was in there, I wrote my own writ of habeas corpus in 2012. Because everybody wants out, and they've got all these jailhouse lawyers. You know, you've run into them. Man, they got some good ones in there, and they've got some pretty bad ones in there. And so it comes time for my final writ, my final appeal, and these guys are like, hey, man, look, you know, we'll do this for you for $100, Mike, and soups and stamps and coffee and cookies. We'll get you out of prison. I'm like, man, it costs more than $100 to get me in this place. It's going to cost more to get me out. But, Mike, more importantly, I've got a brain, and I started using it. I went down to the law. I paid a guy 2 bags of coffee. Two black bags of coffee. Anybody in Texas will understand the black bag. Anybody that's Keefe commissary understands the black bag of coffee. Gave this guy 2 black bags of coffee, Mike. Taught me how to use the law library, 8-hour tutorial one day. It took me 2 months to put together my writ of habeas corpus. And at the end of that, I sent a copy of it to this lawyer in Beaumont that owns his own firm, a guy named Walter Humphrey, huge plaintiff's firm, the Provost Humphrey Law Firm. And I wrote a note attached to it. It said, Mr. Humphrey, if you could please have one of your lawyers look at this writ, I would be very appreciative, and let me know how bad the Court of Criminal Appeals is going to kick my ass at trial. And, you know, he's an old family friend. He's in Beaumont. I'm locked up in a prison that's 10 miles away from where I grew up. I'm in Beaumont, Texas, in prison at the Mark Stiles unit. And he gets back in touch with me at the Mark Stiles unit, and he says, Damon, you put together one hell of a writ for a guy that's never been to law school. He said, when you get out of prison one day, whenever it is, come see me. I may have a job for you. And so I laid around in prison, and I never sat still. I got up every single day, Mike, with that whole intention to work on myself spiritually, mentally, and physically. I got involved in as many chapel programs as I could. I worked as many jobs as I could. There were guys that I ran into in there, and this is the mindset that drove me crazy. Guys that said, man, I'm not going to go work for the man. I'm going to do my time. I'm not going to let my time do me. I'm going to do my time. But they'd sit around and watch TV all day long, watch The Young and the Restless, Jerry Springer, all these damn shows they watch in there, and they didn't do anything with themselves. And guys that would sit around and get morbidly obese, I'd ask them, man, why don't you come out to the rec yard and go run with me? I loved to run when I was in prison. And they're like, oh, no, Wes, I'll take care of that when I get out of prison. I'll get a gym membership. And I'd tell them the same thing, Mike. Life is going to happen for you so fast when you get out of prison, you won't have time to do that. If you're going to make that change, if you want to be somebody else when you get out of here, you've got to start doing it in here. You know, I heard a quote from a guy named Dabo Swinney, who's the head coach at Clemson. When I was speaking to his football team this past August, he said, you bloom where you're planted. He said he was jogging up the stadium, at Death Valley one time, and he saw a weed growing out of the top of the bleachers, 300 feet in the air in concrete. He said, how did that weed grow in concrete way up there in the air? He said, it's because you bloom where you're planted. And that's true, Mike. That's true to life.
You bloom what?
You bloom where you're planted.
You bloom where you're planted.
That's right. You bloom where you're planted. Wherever you're planted, you can bloom. And prison is the harshest environment, one of the toughest places to grow in. I mean, there's no doubt about that. It's not exactly a positive place. It's not the optimum place for growth. But it does not mean that you cannot grow in there, because there's a lot of room and a lot of opportunities. But you have to get involved, Mike. You've got to get involved in the programs that they offer, because they do offer programs. And rehabilitation, just like recovery and everything else, only works if you work it. That's what I tell these guys all the time. You've got to work this program. That's what I told them when I was in there. What do you expect you're going to get out of life if you do nothing different while you're in here? Some of these guys have been to the joint 2, 3, 4 times, and they're doing the same thing they did all those other times. And I'm like, man, you cannot expect something to be different for you if you don't do something different, And I encourage guys that are in there that are addicts to get into recovery, because this is going to be your life. You're going to be that egg forever, but you can turn it around at any time. And that's the wonderful thing about it, Mike. When you have that kind of time on your hands, it's really a unique deal, as you know, Mike, because you've done a little over 2 decades in prison. You know that prison is a 24/7 opportunity to change your life. It's not a punishment if you don't look at it as a punishment. It is an opportunity for optimum growth as a human being. I mean, where else in your life, Mike, are you going to get 24/7 to work on you? It's not available anywhere else.
That's why we got to continue here with figuring out how to keep in harmony what we think, what we feel, what we say, what we do. And when we do that, we can have the same type of transformation that Damon West has experienced. What I'd like to do now, Damon, is because we've come to the end of this episode, we only have about 30 minutes per episode. I'd love it if you could stay for us for one more show so that you could give us the outcomes and the result of what happened because of your pursuit of excellence while you were going through struggle. Could you stick with us for one more episode?
I'd love to, man. Any chance to give back, man, to be useful instead of useless, I'm there, man.
Awesome. So we've been listening to Damon West. This was episode number 2. If you didn't hear episode 1, I encourage you to tune into yesterday's podcast and make sure that you turn into tomorrow's podcast as well, because we're going to hear about how Damon West's experience of going into prison with a 65-year sentence, applying himself and adjusting as if he is a coffee bean and not a carrot or an egg, resulted in him becoming strong, disciplined, motivated, speaking at America's top universities to inspire more people. And you can learn from this type of a story. I know I would have learned from a story like that while I was inside. Hope you do as well. That's what we try to offer with Prison Professors. If you want more information on our program, make sure you visit prisonprofessors.com. But more than anything, I encourage you to come back tomorrow where we will hear the final episode of Damon West. Thank you. Okay, we got to do the same thing here.